International Finance Corporation has invested an additional $459 million in Kenyan companies, cementing its position as one of the largest providers of capital to local firms. In its latest annual report, the institutional investor says that its cumulative investments in Kenyan companies rose to about $4.1 billion in the year ended June. This was an increase from $3.6 billion in the year before. Banks, manufacturers, insurers, and real estate developers are among the entities that have benefited from the IFC's backing in the form of loans and capital subscriptions. Restructuring plans look to be underway at Safaricom. Kenya's largest and most profitable company, Safaricom, plans to convert into a holding company that will house the telecommunications business, the Mpesa mobile money business, and the Ethiopian unit as subsidiaries. Other businesses that Safaricom intends to house in the holding structure include DigiFarm, a new tower company that are currently setting up, and any other company that they might acquire in the future. Joining us from Nairobi to discuss further is investment analyst Kalya Kiptiony. Kalya, thanks so much for joining us. So let's start with the IPO plans. What do you make of the president wanting to list those companies on the Nairobi Securities Exchange over the next 12 months?
Thanks, Ruto, for having me. I think it's a good idea, although there is concern whether the president should actually be involved in the listing of companies in the Nairobi Securities Exchange. But also it points out to the poor performance of the Nairobi Securities Exchange in terms of attracting new companies to join and enlist in the bourse. So on one hand, it looks like a good idea, but then on the other hand, also it's a concern that the market is not being allowed to decide which company should join the bourse.
Okay, so I'm glad you touched on that. I mean, yeah, so should this initiative be coming from the presidency? Shouldn't the NSE be attractive enough to bring in IPOs?
The NSE should be attractive enough to bring in IPOs, but for some reason, this is not happening. And I think most of the activity in terms of listing has been in the GEMS, which is the small and medium enterprises segment of the NSE. But even the companies that are listed there are not really doing that well. So I think there's a lot more work needed to be done by the NSE to be able to encourage companies to join the bourse.
How much of a role will corporate governance play in enticing investors to buy shares in what are now government-owned entities that, if the plans go through, will eventually be privatized?
I think that's a big issue, especially with government-owned enterprises, which have a history of mismanagement. There's just a general lack of confidence in how they're managed, especially the government. So the government or the entities themselves will need to really convince investors that corporate governance is going to be done right for people to be able to buy into the company and believe on their own without necessarily relying.
Are you hearing anything from the private sector, though? Are they warming to that idea of these firms being listed on the NSE?
Yeah, there are discussions on which companies or entities they feel would do well as privatized companies. Although also there's a bit of concern on how they would react, on how competitors, especially, would react to them coming in the market and how to look at that. So there's quite a bit of, I could say, intrigue in the market of people trying to look at which company would do the best in terms of support and which one would struggle a bit.
All right, let's talk about Safaricom and the holdco structure that they're planning. I mean, we've seen that with banks here in Nigeria. What do you make of this this strategy?
I just think it's I would call it a strategic change in how they're going to handle the separate entities. So they have the telco operation in Kenya, Mpesa also the subsidiary in its own, the Ethiopian operations as well. I just think it's a management structure of how they're going to manage these entities. Something similar to what we saw Google doing a number of years back, with Alphabet being the holding company now. So I think it's a move in a similar direction. but I don't anticipate there to be any significant changes in the day-to-day operation, the customer side, how they receive services.
The CEO of Safaricom, Peter Ndegwa, he granted an interview with a local Kenyan paper, I think it's the Standard, where he said that there's no plans to split Mpesa from Safaricom. And there was pressure from lawmakers. I think they put forward a bill, and I think we talked about it with you last time, if I remember correctly, or we talked about it with, we had someone that was on the show that we talked about this issue. So, I mean, there's a bill that to split it. He's saying it's not going to be split. Well, what do you make of that development?
I think there's been a lot of talk on splitting Mpesa from Safaricom, having it run with its own independent entity. But I think we saw Airtel doing something similar with their mobile network. I think from Safaricom's perspective, I feel like they're happy with the way things are at the moment. I don't know whether there are any significant benefits that will come with splitting. I think the main concern has been the services that are offered by Mpesa, most notably being Deliver and Kiptiony, which is short-term credit and loan services that I think people have been feeling maybe need supervision from the central bank. But other than that, I think Peter Ndegwa in the same interview mentioned that they are not planning to roll out their own credit facilities, but we continue with the partners that they do have, which are banks. So in that sense, I think for now they're still going to keep it. I would think the major advantage of splitting it would be help it grow cross borders more quickly and maybe gain more acceptance in other countries faster.
All right, but I mean, isn't M-Pesa more valuable as its own entity? Recently, a competitor of Safaricom, Airtel Networks Limited, they recently completed the separation of their mobile money business from its telecommunications services. So, I mean, putting the bill aside, at some point, would it not make sense to have M-Pesa spun off as its own single entity?
I think it would make sense, but I think if you think about it, looking at the current structure, with Safaricom now being a holding company and M-Pesa being one of the subsidiaries, then technically you could argue that it is its own entity that now reports and remits dividends to Safaricom, the holding company. So I feel like the decisions being made at the subsidiary level will be independent of the decisions made by Safaricom, the telco, and even Safaricom equity. So technically, I feel like they've been able to split it without necessarily having it morph into its own separate entity.
All right, macro view of all of this, what does this say about the, I guess, telecommunications sector in Kenya, what it means to the economy with all this, talk around Safaricom? In fact, we're talking about IPOs. I think Safaricom was the last bona fide IPO that happened in Kenya, right? So, so what does all this say about the telco sector?
I think the telecom sector in Kenya has really grown, I think, compared to the rest of Africa in terms of internet penetration, mobile access, pretty high. And especially with the innovation that with M-Pesa, the number of lives that it affects directly through, if you're an M-Pesa agent, you have a shop, or through Mshwari, Deliver, and the like, I think it's very significant. A huge number of the population is affected uses these services on a daily basis. But the concern is that M-Pesa being, or Safaricom being as dominant as it is, of course there are concerns monopoly issues and the rates that people are being charged, especially when it comes to these M-Pesa services. And President Ruto has been talking about the Hustler Fund, which is meant to give access to money to people, but at single-digit interest rates. And if this happens, maybe it would be a competitor to M-Pesa and help them being passed down. But in terms of the impact, I think the impact being felt is countrywide. Is actually benefiting from it.
All right, let's quickly talk about the IFC, International Finance Corporation, and the funding of SMEs in Kenya. Is their assistance being felt?
Yeah, I think the assistance is being felt to some extent. I think a good portion of IFC money has gone to the major commercial banks, your equities, ACB. In that sense, I'm not sure that the impact is being felt as greatly as it should be. My own personal opinion is that this financing is mostly going towards government paper, which is not meant to be the case. But in terms of the direct investment into some of the companies, for instance, if you look at Naivas supermarket, which I have seen invested in directly, you could see how the performance has improved since. You can see how it's more stable, especially in an environment where the supermarket retail chains in Kenya were really, really struggling, mainly collapsing. So in terms of direct investment into companies, so we've seen diverse, Trigger as well, Trigger Food, the impact is being felt like that. I'm not really happy with how the banks have handled the loan.
Thank you so much, investment analyst, for taking us through those headlines coming from Kenya. We appreciate your time very much.